USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. An in-depth look at this week's top college hockey matchup and a preview of the other big games.
Welcome to the USCHO Games of the Week podcast for Thursday, January 30th. And we say games because we're looking ahead to the Beanpot semifinals on Monday. This episode is brought to you by the 2020 NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit, Michigan. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly.
And joining us to talk about the Beanpot is, I guess my only word to title him is Boston Globe sports writer emeritus. That's John Powers, one of the legends of Boston sports. John, it's great to talk to you. And I know you love the Beanpot, so what a great time of year to have you on.
It's great. Actually, what's been interesting there is that I just was doing a little research. If you'd told me 10 years ago that you would have Harvard and BU, or Harvard and Northeastern, being the two teams in NCAA last year and not BU and BC, this is like back to the 80s, isn't it?
It really is, and that was where I kind of wanted to start with this. I mean, the only time in this tournament's history, more than 60 years now, that all four teams have won in the same decade was the 1980s, and now we had it again in the 2010s. But you go back to the middle of the last decade, 2010s, so you end up around the 15s, and you didn't think that Northeastern or Harvard ever stood a chance. They've now won the last three Beanpots combined.
That's right. And not only that, if you told me that the last place team the last 3 years would be either BU or BC, that's just stunning. And I think it's been great for the tournament because we used to joke about this when BU was dominating as the Jack Parker Invitational. But you looked at the 23 BC-BU finals. 23. And that has now changed. You know, you look at there was a period, I think, in the 90s and the aughts when BU won that thing 15 times. And then BC won 5 in a row between like 2010 and 14. And now there is actually an element of doubt as to who might win this, which has been great for the tournament.
I was going to say, I mean, we got to a point, probably around 3 or 4 years ago where for the first time, the Garden was comfortable enough saying, listen, we didn't sell out, even though there was nights in the years before that you would look at sections of 500, 600 empty seats and you'd still see a sellout number. The Garden started admitting that they weren't selling this tournament out. Now we are back to the 1980s and the renewed interest because everybody seems to have a chance. Do you think that even, a place like your alma mater, Harvard, they seem to even care a little bit more about this tournament than they did 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think, the fact is that people forget there was always, how long it had been. Northeastern went 30 years between winning it. Well, Harvard went 24 years between winning it. They won one in 1993 and didn't do it again until 2017. So there was very little, and this is at a time when suddenly Harvard basketball was making the NCAAs. So I think you'd see a demographic change also. Harvard's much more of a global school, fewer hockey fans than there certainly were back in my day, probably more interested in basketball. But a good Harvard hockey team will still bring a lot of people, over from Cambridge. And I think this one is at least going to be in the chase.
Yeah, certainly. I think that, all four teams feel like they're on somewhat level ground, especially last weekend, Boston College, which had seemed to be the team that was running away with things. They get swept at home by Maine. So, now you're suddenly thinking maybe everybody has a chance. What do you think about this first round of the Beanpot? You have Harvard and Northeastern playing one another in the early game and then BCBU in the late game.
Yeah, it's interesting. Harvard doesn't play Northeastern every year normally. So I think it's been several years since they've actually seen each other. Harvard's an interesting group in that you look at how many points they've left on the table. There were at least 3 games where they were up 2 goals and were not able to get a win. And last weekend was just agonizing for them. They go up to Cornell. They have Cornell down 1-0 and the cage is empty and they give up a power play goal and they go to overtime. If Harvard plays a full 60, they can beat anybody in that tournament. I mean, you saw the game against BC where they're up 2 goals and suddenly, bam, 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 they're down. It is a young team that often plays young. And I think Northeastern would have to be favored in that game. But it would not surprise me to see Harvard win it. BUBC always, it's they had a very close game the other day. I like the way BC's been playing, but as you said last week against Maine, what was that?
John, as somebody who's been around the game a while, I certainly understand tradition and appreciate to a large extent what is so great about the Beanpot. But for those outside of the Boston area, especially our friends who listen in the Midwest and other parts of the country, what is it that is so special and so compelling about this tournament?
Well, I think the thing, it's funny, you just saw this finally, they got all 4 teams in the state of Connecticut playing. It is a neighborhood rivalry. You can get to all 4 of those on the tee. It may take a while on the tee, but you can do it. And people grew up rooting for one team or the other. You don't root for Harvard and BU. You have your group. And this, people make their choices early. I mean, when I was at high school, you already knew which team you were for. And those things don't really change. So I think one thing about Boston was it was always tribal, and it was about bragging rights. I tell people I was up at Lake Placid for the Olympics, and the U.S. is coming out for practice one morning, and Eruzione looks up and says, "Who won the Beanpot?" I said, "Northeastern." He said, "Northeastern." He turned around and looked at Jocko Callahan and said, "Oh, see, Northeastern won the Beanpot." He said, "It wouldn't happen when we were there."
Well, that is truly what makes this tournament ultra special. John, give me your favorite Beanpot memory of all of them that you covered. And I know that even in your days after retiring for the Globe, I've seen you at a couple of tournaments. What are some of the things you really remember about this tournament?
Well, I think one thing that was really fun for me was how many times I wrote in a Globe Advance, could this be finally the year of the Hound? Could this be Northeastern's year? And finally it was. And I said, you know what? I saw the Americans lose the America's Cup. I was at Lake Placid. So this is something I didn't think I would see in my lifetime, was Northeastern win this thing. Because when they did win it in the 80s, I was at the Olympics both of those years. So I had never seen them actually win the Beanpot. And my father went there. One of my brothers went there. Jack Reynolds, who I love dearly, and his nickname was 615 Grenoble because that's when they used to play the second night. They were never in the final. So I think that to me was something that because that put the tournament back on the map for me. I mean, I do think for a while people were losing interest because it was always BU or BC, and it was like a 2-team tournament. So I think to see Northeastern do it and then do it again was quite impressive.
John, before I let you go, a little bit of a different topic. I had a story today as the search for the commissioner of Hockey East goes on. It has kind of come out to many people that there's athletic directors that think that Hockey East doesn't need to be its own conference anymore, and that maybe it could be an affiliate sport for another league like America East or the CAA. You've been around this game long enough to know the brand equity that Hockey East has. Could you ever see Hockey East not existing as a conference?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, normally what happens when you see conferences break up is because there are better options elsewhere. What was very telling, if you looked at when they had the enormous shakeup a few years ago, especially in the West, Hockey East was fine. I think the ECAC, those teams are linked academically. But I do think if you look year after year, Hockey East does quite well, top to bottom, more years than not. They certainly held their own in the Frozen Four. I don't think, I'm not sure it does any better, that they do any better going elsewhere.
I agree with you there. I think that they have built too much right now to change anything. Well, John Powers, I always appreciate the opportunity to catch up. You're just a great friend, not just to myself, but to college hockey. So great to talk to you. And I hope you get to, I know you're not going to be at the Beanpot, but I hope you get to watch both games somewhere from a deck chair in Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
I'll be seated next to the Seagulls.
That's John Powers. Boston Globe writer emeritus in my mind. Thanks for your time, John.
More of the Game of the Week podcast coming up in a moment after this word from the NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit.
This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Every time you show up, every time you make your presence heard, whether you clap your hands or stomp your feet, lead the chant or join the chorus. However you choose to be a fan, you make the game. The NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th at Little Caesars Arena in Detroit. Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4 to get your tickets today.
This is the Game or Games of the Week podcast here on USCHO.com. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. And Jim, we say games because on Monday it is the semifinals of the Beanpot. And what's really interesting in this is that the teams that were long doormats are probably going to be contesting, but we do have a resurgent Boston College around this year too. So things seem pretty interesting to me.
I think this is actually one of the more interesting fields that we have had. None of the teams are just explosive. BC was in a great place, I think, going into the last week, and then they lose 2 overtime games to Maine. That brings them back to earth. BU had a great weekend last weekend against Lowell. Harvard, as John mentioned, they kind of didn't win either game. They got 2 ties last weekend, but they had a lead at Cornell and ended up in a 1-1 tie there. I just feel like you throw Northeastern into that because I think they're the 2-time defending champion. They're a competent team. I feel like we have a lot of good matchups. What is very interesting, and we didn't mention this with John, is for the first time in my memory of this tournament, the defending champion will not play in the late game on Monday night. That was always kind of the unwritten tradition of the Beanpot, was if you win the championship, you get to play the late game the next year on the semifinal night. Well, this time you have Northeastern playing Harvard, easily the kind of least appealing to television of the matchup. So they moved Northeastern out of the late game slot. Jim Madigan tried to make the best of it when I talked to him this week. He said, at least he knows when the game will start and what time they'll probably be over at. And, he kind of put a smile on his face, but you have to think that it's almost like a little sign of disrespect for Northeastern not putting them in the 8:00 game. And hey, that could make them hungrier than ever to win yet another Beanpot.
Well, and it may mean their fans get to be there and not have to worry about a game starting late because of overtime. And there's some great history of that in the Beanpot too.
Certainly, and that is one of the great things about Northeastern fans, that if you played that game at 10:00 in the morning on Monday, they'd still be there. They find the way to get there. They love the Beanpot, one of the better student sections out there. And certainly at the Beanpot, they do a great job. The one thing that kind of bums me out, if you will, is that Harvard is now in the 5:00 game. Their fans don't seem to be great at showing up for the 5:00 game. You put them in the 8:00 game, sometimes they're a little bit better. It is the lowest probably volume of a fan base out there. I can remember as a kid wanting to go to the Beanpot, and my mother would always go to Harvard on the Monday of the first semifinal and buy the tickets because they didn't have all their tickets sold. Everybody else did. So it has never been traditionally the best fan base, and at a 5:00 start, it might not be that great. But listen, you're still going to end up with BCBU in the premier matchup. These games this year are nationally televised in the United States on NHL Network. They're going to be internationally televised in Canada on TSN. I think this is about as good of an exposure as you can get for college hockey this week coming up.
While it's been a tough season for BU, they could still play spoiler. It seems to me like it's anybody's tournament this year.
Jack Parker, when he was the coach at BU, used to say that he would stop screwing up his team somewhere around the Beanpot. He'd screw them up all year, and then at the Beanpot, they'd get there, they'd play well, win the Beanpot, and then they go on to have a great postseason. This year's team, you could almost say the same thing, and not that I think that Albie O'Connell has screwed much up, but it hasn't been the BU team that a lot of people expected. I thought they played great last weekend against UMass Lowell, really dominated Friday's game, found a way to earn a tie on Saturday on the road. I think they're playing their best hockey right now coming into it. So when you consider that, and then you realize the fact that Harvard, BC, and Northeastern have been pretty strong all year. I saw Harvard out in California, out in Irvine. I really thought they were a fast skating team. As John Powers mentioned, they are young. That is one issue that kind of bites them every now and again. But I think that all four of these teams have potential. This is one of the tougher fields to handicap in Beanpot history.
And for the Terriers, they will not end up with a tie. They've already had 6 of them this season. They don't need another one.
That is for sure.
Obviously, there won't be one in the tournament. Well, while we're talking Hockey East, there's not much of a schedule on Saturday with a couple of the teams, 3 of the teams having to play in the Beanpot on Monday. But there are a couple of premier matchups on Friday. Number 9, Providence at number 13, Northeastern, and number 5, BC at number 7, UMass.
I always say that for the coaches of the Beanpot schools, maybe the toughest game of their season is the game before the Beanpot. And that's the case now, not just because of the opponent, but it's hard to keep your players focused. It's such a big event on your campus. You hear about it all week leading up to it. So it's going to be very difficult for both BC and Northeastern to stay focused. I think one of the best things is having tough opponents. And I think both of those matchups are really important, not just for your pairwise, but just position within Hockey East. Northeastern didn't play last weekend and, basically got passed over by a bunch of teams and find themselves, I believe, in a tie for 6th place right now in Hockey East. So it's very difficult when you're looking at staying focused on the Friday night game. I think the coaches over the years have done a better job with that. And the fact that you only have one game that weekend before the Beanpot, even Harvard falls into that. The ECAC has not been as kind as Hockey East in making that schedule. But this year, both weeks for Harvard, they only have a single game. I think that helps you keep your team a little bit more focused. When
you look at Boston College and UMass in that game, BC swept last weekend, both games in overtime by an upstart Maine Black Bears team. And UMass lost 1-0 on Friday and a 1-1 tie on Saturday with New Hampshire. That's got to have the Minutemen wondering where their offense is going to come from.
Yeah, I always like it when you get 2 teams that feel a little bit desperate, and I think that BC and UMass both will feel a little desperate in this game. The fact that it's out in Amherst should be an advantage for UMass, but the last time these 2 teams faced, they split the series with both road teams winning. So I guess you never know, but you do at this point have 2 teams that should be playing with a lot of desperation.
When we look at the ECAC, only one really premier matchup, at least among ranked teams. On Friday, number 1 Cornell travels to number 18 Quinnipiac. Cornell had 1 tie last weekend. Quinnipiac lost on Sunday in the championship game of the Connecticut Ice Festival to Sacred Heart. Here are a couple of teams that are vying for postseason position. Cornell near the top in the pairwise. Quinnipiac needs to watch out in a game like this.
Well, this is actually a really big night for Quinnipiac because if you can win that game, you're at home, you win that game, that's your pairwise bump that you need to maybe put yourself into relevance 14-13. And then the next night, you obviously take on Colgate so that you have the ability to make a really solid weekend if you can win both games at home, and you're gonna see Quinnipiac take that jump if they were to pull out the 2 victories. Cornell, on the other hand, they're very solid right now. I mean, they're in an NCAA bid. There's no way that they're not going to qualify for the tournament in my mind right now. Now you're just trying to make sure that you do everything you can to get that number 1 overall seed. They're in a good position to do that. But they've got to still put some wins together in order to jump up. This is one of those games within the within the ECAC that Cornell can earn that victory and improve their RPI enough that they could move up potentially, depending on what happens with North Dakota. So I guess for both teams, there's a lot on the line, more so for Quinnipiac because I know that they want an NCAA berth, but there's nothing guaranteed right now for the Bobcats.
One more league in the East, and that's Atlantic Hockey. We talked on Weekend Review what a tight race that is in there. It's an opportunity for some teams maybe to pick up some points and maybe some challenges for other. Mercyhurst near the bottom, in fact, at the bottom of the standings in Atlantic Hockey, travels for a pair of games at AIC. Army West Point is home hosting Canisius, a team near the bottom of the standings also, but one that put up 4 goals in 2 losses last weekend. This is a key place for both AIC and Army to pick up some points because, meanwhile, Sacred Heart, tied with AIC for first place, has the unenviable task of going out to Air Force, which is tough for anybody to play in.
Certainly those 3 series really kind of do draw my attention. And, Canisius, obviously we know that they did something pretty spectacular a few weeks ago down in Sacred Heart. Army West Point, they're coming off of 2 losses to Niagara. That's, so you're in a position where Canisius maybe has a little bit of confidence, and Army is kind of licking their wounds after last weekend. AIC, I don't want them in any way to take it lightly against Mercyhurst, because that's a team that you take them lightly, they're still a very good hockey team. I know this has probably been a very frustrating season for Rick Gawkin, their veteran head coach, but this could be the weekend that Mercyhurst is waiting for, to go on the road and play a team that's tough and that you can feel good about yourself if you can pull out some points. So that's a big one. And then you also look at Sacred Heart, as you said, going out to Air Force, no matter where Air Force is in the standings, going out there to playing at altitude. It's just a tough trip. It's just not one of the easiest trips. Sacred Heart, we have seen that the effect of being nationally ranked many times this year on Atlantic teams, and it seems when you get into the rankings, that next weekend is the weekend that maybe you feel a little too good about yourself and you don't play seriously enough. So I think that's a very difficult matchup for them, having to go out to Air Force. But it's just that time of the year that we know how tight things are at the top of the Atlantic standings, and all 3 of these matchups will go a long way in maybe earning or deciding some points that could be pretty key.
Yeah, you either take things lightly or more likely you have a bigger target on your back. Well, let's head out westward. The NCHC, one matchup stands out more than any of the others, although they will all be good. But this one, number 10, Minnesota Duluth at number 4, Denver. Denver has the longest unbeaten streak in the country right now.
Yeah, the only team in the top 20 last weekend to win both of its games. Of teams that played, there were a lot of teams idle, but obviously Denver's playing well. Duluth, I still think that they're playing pretty good hockey right now, and that becomes a big challenge for the Pioneers at home. They've been a great home team this year, and that's something that they can take a lot of pride in. But you have a very tough opponent, and obviously positioning within the NCHC standings is kind of paramount to this weekend. So you're right. There are 4 great series this weekend, but this one does stand out. I also look at, Colorado College going to North Dakota, not an easy challenge for them, but I always feel that every time things get difficult for Mike Havlin and his team, that's when they actually play the best hockey.
In the Big Ten, it's a weekend that could either continue to jumble things or maybe separate things. Notre Dame has the task of heading in for a pair at number 8, Penn State. Notre Dame desperately needs a couple of wins right now.
They do, and this is not the place they need to go and face an offense that scores. Notre Dame plays their best hockey usually when they play from ahead, and going into Penn State, that's not a place that you think of being able to kind of sit on leads and, kind of nurse a 2-1 win. This in the confidence level for the Irish has to be pretty low right now. I know that they got a win last Saturday night. That's a good thing. But Penn State at the same time, they haven't been playing their best hockey. They've been playing good enough hockey over the last few weekends, but this becomes a big weekend for them. They know that they have a kind of an animal that's wounded, and can you got to help nurse that animal back to health, or you got to kind of kick it and make sure that it stays down. It's one of those situations where if you're Guy Godowski that this is a team that probably should play with desperation. They might not play with confidence, and you've got to be able to take advantage when you have the opportunity.
Number 11, Ohio State was swept last weekend at Minnesota. This week they head on the road again to Yost Ice Arena, and a Michigan team that's been playing very well as of late.
Yeah, I mean, Mel Pearson's squad has been pretty solid, and that's one thing that you have to take away from this is, they had 2 great games with Penn State going back a couple of weekends. Last weekend was just a simple exhibition against the U.S. under-18 team. But, I think it's 4 wins out of the last 5 and 6 wins out of the last 8 for Michigan. They're playing their best hockey right now. And Ohio State, you kind of lick your wounds a little bit after last weekend with Minnesota. So this becomes one of those series where both teams understand there's a lot on the line. But, Michigan, you're hoping to carry something on, even though you really haven't played in a couple of weeks and shown a lot of good things in a couple of weeks. Ohio State, you're realizing this is our opportunity. We've got to find a way to head on the road and play our best hockey after we didn't do that last weekend.
Meanwhile, Minnesota, who had the 2 home wins last weekend, heads on the road to Wisconsin, to the Kohl Center. Great weekend sweep for Minnesota. Wisconsin continues to be up and down. They've got so many splits on the weekend. It looks like maybe this could be another one of those.
Why not? I mean, if you're splitting every series, that means Minnesota's going to win on Friday, Wisconsin's going to win on Saturday. That's the way it's been going for the Badgers. But this used to be in the WCHA days a pretty good rivalry, and I feel like that that should carry into this weekend a little bit. Minnesota, if they're as hungry as they seem they should be, coming off a great weekend, you hope that you can keep that rolling. But Wisconsin, as you mentioned, they just haven't been a team to be that impressive, but at the same time, they're not getting swept over the last month or so. And that's a big part of, carrying some points out of a weekend. Can they be frustrating for Minnesota? I think they absolutely can. And that'll be kind of one of the big series to keep an eye on, whether Minnesota can take the 6 points it really needs to help help themselves in the Big Ten standings, or will Wisconsin get their traditional split and make it more frustrating?
When we look at the WCHA, one series stands out. Bowling Green dropping out of the USCHO.com poll this week at number 19 Bemidji State, who rose into the poll. But this is a big game for both teams, but I think even more desperate for Bowling Green to get into the top half of the WCHA solidly.
No doubt. I mean, this is a team that had very high expectations. Probably penciled them in around second place before the season started. They haven't played as well over the last month, and that's a big struggle. Whereas Bemidji, I think, has played probably their best hockey over the last 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe even 10 weeks, going back into like late November. I think that Bemidji is a real deal. And if anybody will give Minnesota State some sort of a battle, it will be Bemidji. So this is kind of their opportunity to play a good opponent, keep playing well, and solidify their position within the standings.
And this weekend in non-conference play, number 12 Arizona State hosts Robert Morris for a pair. We've talked quite a bit week after week about how important the pairwise is to Arizona State because it's the only way they get into the NCAA tournament. They're in a good position right now, but if they don't have success against Robert Morris, they could be in trouble. Robert Morris, interestingly enough, at least traditionally, and I haven't seen the Colonials this season, but traditionally, they're a team that is not unlike Arizona State. Strong goaltending and opportunistic offense that can score in bunches. They may not have the same level of talent as Arizona State, but some good goaltending and some opportunity, and the Sun Devils could be in for a battle.
Oh, I think that Robert Morris can be a pain in the butt for any team that they face, and especially knowing that they're going to face a very good opponent this week in Arizona State. It's one of those situations where Arizona State has to look at the rest of their schedule and know what they have left, and the next 4 games are against Atlantic hockey teams, and we've talked about it long enough now. They have to win these games. These are the ones they have to cement into the win column before they host Alaska, Anchorage, and then they have to head to Wisconsin at the end. I don't think you want to – I don't care that Wisconsin is last place in the Big Ten right now. You don't want, if you're Arizona State, to head on the road on February 21st and 22nd knowing that you need 2 wins just to give yourself a chance in the pairwise. Win these 2 games this weekend, win 2 games at Holy Cross and Bentley next weekend. Then you can feel good about yourself. You feel a lot better. You get Alaska twice at home. If you win these next 6 games, if you're Arizona State, you're probably going to put yourself in perfect position. You'll be probably somewhere around 7 in the pairwise, maybe 8. And those 2 Wisconsin games, they'll take care of themselves.
Or if you don't take care of business and you need those Wisconsin games, and Wisconsin at that time will probably know that they have to win the Big Ten tournament to get into the NCAA tournament, they're going to be all wound up, ready to play spoiler.
It's really hard. That's the position that they could be put in, and that's something that I think would be the most difficult challenge that Arizona State will face.
Well, it's a great weekend of hockey coming up, a 3-day weekend extending into Monday, and that will about do it for this episode of USCHO Game of the Week podcast. We've been sponsored by the NCAA Frozen Four. April 9th and 11th in Detroit. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Game of the Week podcast, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit USCHO.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.